The spring of 1525 arrived in the German territories not with the promise of renewal, but with the weight of centuries pressing down upon the backs of those who worked the land. Across the fields of Swabia, Franconia, and Thuringia, men and women rose before dawn, their hands calloused, their bodies bent from labor that never ceased. They planted seeds they would never fully harvest, tended livestock they could not eat, and watched their children grow thin while the granaries of their lords overflowed. For generations, this had been the order of things. The peasants worked. The knights ruled. God, they were told, had ordained it so. But something was shifting beneath the surface of that spring soil. In village squares and monastery courtyards, in the quiet moments between backbreaking labor, words were being spoken that had never been spoken before. Words about fairness, about rights, about the value of a human life, regardless of the armor one wore or the title one inherited. The Reformation had cracked open the door to questioning authority, and through that door, dangerous ideas were flooding in. If the church could be wrong, if the Pope himself could be challenged, then what about the nobles who claimed divine right to rule? What about the knights who took half of every harvest, who demanded labor without compensation, who treated human beings as property to be bought and sold? In the towns and villages, a quiet awakening was taking place. And the powerful, secure in their castles and confident in their military superiority, did not see it coming. What happens when 300,000 people, scattered across 1,000 villages, suddenly realize they are not alone? What happens when the oppressed discover that their oppressors are not invincible giants, but a small handful of men whose power rests entirely on the belief that they cannot be challenged? In the fields of Germany in 1525, that question was about to receive an answer that would echo through the centuries. An answer written not in the elegant script of scholars, but in the blood and courage of those who had been told they were nothing and who decided to prove otherwise. The feudal system that governed Germany in the early 16th century was a machine designed to extract every possible resource from those at the bottom to benefit those at the top. The peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, owned nothing. Not their homes, not their tools, not even, in many cases, their own bodies. They were tied to the land they worked, forbidden from leaving without permission, required to provide labor to their lords whenever demanded. They paid taxes on everything, on the grain they grew, on the animals they raised, on the fish they caught, on the wood they gathered for their fires. They paid taxes to be married, taxes to inherit what little their parents left them, taxes even to die and be buried in the ground they had worked their entire lives. Above them stood the knights and nobles, a warrior class that numbered perhaps 3,000 fighting men across the affected territories. They lived in stone fortresses, wore armor that cost more than a peasant family would earn in 10 lifetimes, and trained from childhood in the art of war. They were professional soldiers, mounted on powerful horses, wielding weapons of steel, protected by layers of metal that could turn aside most blows. For centuries, these men had been undefeatable in battle. A single knight could cut through dozens of poorly armed peasants. A small company of knights could scatter an entire village of resistors. The social order was maintained not just through law and custom, but through the very real threat of overwhelming military force. But numbers tell a different story than tradition. In the spring of 1525, across the German territories, there were approximately 300,000 peasants of fighting age. Men who swung hammers and axes every day. Men who could march for miles carrying heavy loads. Men who knew the land intimately, every forest path and river crossing. And increasingly, men who had nothing left to lose. When you have already lost your home, your food, your dignity, when your children are starving and your future holds nothing but more suffering, the fear that keeps you obedient begins to fade. And when that fear fades, simple mathematics begins to assert itself. 300,000 against 3,000. 100 to 1. But for this arithmetic to matter, the 300,000 would first have to realize they existed as a collective force, not as isolated, powerless individuals scattered across countless villages. The spark came from multiple directions at once. Preachers inspired by Martin Luther's challenge to authority, though Luther himself would later condemn the violence, traveled from town to town speaking of equality before God. If all souls were equal in heaven, they asked, why should bodies be so unequal on earth? Pamphlets, printed on the new presses that were spreading across Europe, circulated with revolutionary ideas. The 12 Articles of the Swabian Peasants, drafted in the town of Memmingen, laid out reasonable demands: the right to choose their own pastors, a reduction in the tithe, the restoration of common lands that had been enclosed by nobles, an end to serfdom. These were not wild revolutionary fantasies. They were practical requests for basic human dignity. But the nobles refused. To concede even the smallest point would be to admit that peasants had rights, that the social order was negotiable, that power could be questioned. And so they said no. They said it with contempt, with mockery, with threats of violence against anyone who dared to complain. They said it because they had always said it, and because they believed that nothing could challenge their dominance. They were wrong. In village after village, the decision was made. If words would not work, if petitions would be ignored, if pleas for basic fairness would be met with violence, then there was only one option left: resistance. The peasants began to gather. Small groups at first, then larger ones. Dozens became hundreds. Hundreds became thousands. And as they gathered, something remarkable happened. They looked around and saw not a scattered collection of powerless individuals, but an army larger than any force the knights could possibly assemble. An army that had been there all along, invisible only because no one had thought to count. The peasant bands organized themselves with surprising efficiency. They elected captains, often men with some military experience from previous wars. They established supply lines, drawing on the very skills of organization and logistics they had used to manage farms and villages. They armed themselves with whatever they could find: farming tools converted into weapons, hunting spears, clubs, a few stolen or captured swords and crossbows. They were not equipped like knights. They had no plate armor, no war horses, no artillery. But they had numbers. And numbers, used correctly, could be their own form of power. The first encounters were small. A manor house burned. A tax collector driven out of town. A minor noble's convoy ambushed on a forest road. The knights responded as they always had, with swift and brutal force. They would ride into a village that had supported the rebellion, killing indiscriminately, burning homes, making examples of those who dared to resist. This had always worked before. Fear had always driven the peasants back into submission. But this time, something was different. This time, instead of scattering and hiding, the peasants fought back. And when the knights pursued them, expecting easy prey, they found themselves surrounded by hundreds of angry men with improvised weapons and nothing left to lose. News of successful resistance spread like wildfire. Villages that had been on the fence suddenly joined the rebellion. The peasant armies swelled. In Thuringia, the radical preacher Thomas Müntzer inspired thousands with visions of divine justice and equality. In Franconia, the peasants captured the town of Heilbronn and established their own government. In Swabia, multiple peasant bands numbering tens of thousands each marched through the countryside, their ranks growing daily. For the first time in memory, it was the knights who felt fear. They retreated to their castles, sent urgent messages to each other calling for reinforcements, and watched from their walls as oceans of angry peasants flowed past. The peasants were discovering their power, but they were also discovering its complexity. With 300,000 people involved, spread across hundreds of miles, maintaining unity and coordination was nearly impossible. Different bands had different leaders, different goals, different tactics. Some wanted only to achieve the 12 Articles and then return to their farms. Others, inspired by radical preachers, wanted to overthrow the entire social order and establish a new world of complete equality. Some were disciplined and organized. Others were little more than angry mobs, burning and looting without strategy. The lack of unified command, which had seemed irrelevant when numbers were all that mattered, was beginning to show itself as a fatal weakness. The knights and nobles, meanwhile, were doing what they had done for centuries, organizing for war. They put aside their own feuds and rivalries to face the common threat. They sent for reinforcements from neighboring territories. They hired professional mercenaries, the landsknechts, who were experienced soldiers trained in the latest military tactics. They assembled artillery, cannon that could break defensive positions and devastate closely packed formations. And most importantly, they concentrated their forces. While the peasants were spread across the countryside in multiple separate armies, the nobles began to gather their troops into unified, disciplined fighting forces. At Frankenhausen, in Thuringia, the moment of reckoning arrived. Thomas Müntzer had gathered approximately 8,000 peasants and positioned them on a hilltop, forming a defensive circle of wagons. He told them that God would protect them, that the bullets of their enemies would be turned aside by divine intervention. He told them they were righteous, that history was on their side, that they outnumbered their oppressors and could not fail. The peasants, looking at their numbers and believing in their cause, prepared to make their stand. On the morning of May 15th, 1525, the combined forces of the nobles advanced. They numbered perhaps 8,000 as well, but these were professional soldiers, knights in full armor, landsknecht mercenaries with pikes and arquebus firearms, artillery pieces pulled by teams of horses. The nobles sent a final demand for surrender. Müntzer refused. The peasants, looking down from their hilltop at the approaching army, still believed in their numbers. They still believed that 100 peasants were worth more than one knight. The artillery opened fire. The cannonballs, iron spheres weighing 15 or 20 pounds, crashed into the wagon circle with devastating effect. Wooden wagons exploded into splinters. Bodies were torn apart. The peasants had never experienced artillery before. The noise alone was terrifying, like thunder concentrated into a single, impossibly loud blast that repeated again and again. Men who had stood firm in the belief that God would protect them watched their companions disintegrate and realized that divine intervention was not coming. Panic began to spread. The knights and mercenaries advanced behind the artillery barrage. The landsknechts formed up in tight squares, their long pikes creating a forest of steel points that could impale anyone who came close. The knights mounted their war horses, lances ready, preparing to charge. The peasants, their defensive circle broken by artillery, their ranks disordered by panic, found themselves facing professional soldiers in open battle. Numbers suddenly mattered much less than training, equipment, and discipline. The charge came like a hammer blow. Knights in full armor, mounted on horses bred for war, crashed into the peasant lines with overwhelming force. Men were trampled, impaled, cut down. The landsknechts moved forward methodically, their pike formations unbreakable, their firearms picking off anyone who tried to flee. The peasants fought desperately. Some stood their ground and died where they stood. Others tried to run and were cut down from behind. A few attempted to surrender and were killed anyway. The nobles had decided that mercy would only encourage future rebellions. They wanted a message sent, written in blood, that would be remembered for generations. By the end of the day, approximately 5,000 peasants lay dead on the field at Frankenhausen. Müntzer was captured, tortured, and executed. The survivors scattered, carrying with them the terrible knowledge that numbers alone were not enough. The revelation that had seemed so powerful, the realization that they outnumbered their oppressors 100 to 1, had proven insufficient in the face of superior weapons, training, and coordination. The mathematical advantage that had filled them with hope had been overcome by the brutal realities of military power. But Frankenhausen was only one battle. Across Germany, other peasant armies were still in the field. In Swabia, the Baltringen band numbered 20,000 strong. In Franconia, multiple peasant armies were besieging castles and occupying towns. The war was far from over. The nobles, emboldened by their victory at Frankenhausen, moved to crush each peasant army in turn. They used the same tactics everywhere. Concentrate superior forces, use artillery to break defensive positions, employ cavalry and professional infantry to destroy disordered peasant formations, and show no mercy to survivors. Battle after battle followed the same pattern. The peasants fought bravely. They died in enormous numbers. And slowly, inexorably, the rebellion was drowned in blood. By the summer of 1525, the Peasants' War was effectively over. The estimates of total deaths vary, but most historians believe that approximately 100,000 peasants were killed in the fighting and the brutal reprisals that followed. Villages that had supported the rebellion were burned. Leaders were hunted down and executed with theatrical cruelty, their bodies displayed as warnings. The surviving peasants were driven back into servitude, their legal conditions often worse than before the rebellion began. The nobles, who had been genuinely frightened by the uprising, made sure that the lesson was clear: resistance would be met with annihilation. But something had changed, even in defeat. The peasants had discovered that they outnumbered their oppressors. They had discovered that they could organize, could fight, could challenge the order that had seemed eternal and unchangeable. They had failed, but the very fact of their trying had altered something fundamental in the social consciousness. The nobles knew now that their power was not invincible, that it rested on a foundation that could crack under pressure. They would spend the following decades strengthening their control, building better fortifications, maintaining larger standing armies, precisely because they had been shown that the masses could rise. The fear that the peasants had always felt for the knights was now matched by a new fear that the knights felt for the peasants. In the villages and fields of Germany, the survivors returned to their labor. They planted crops and tended animals. They paid their taxes and bowed to their lords. But they remembered. They remembered what it felt like to stand together, 300,000 strong. They remembered that moment of realization, when they understood that their oppressors were vastly outnumbered. They remembered that they had fought, and though they had lost, they had made the powerful tremble. That memory would be passed down through generations, whispered in taverns and around fires, a dangerous seed planted in the collective consciousness of the oppressed. The Peasants' War of 1525 failed in its immediate objectives. The feudal system continued for centuries afterward. The peasants remained oppressed, exploited, denied basic rights and dignity. But the war had proven something that could never be unproven: that numbers mattered, that the masses had potential power, that the social order was maintained not by divine mandate or natural law, but by force and the willingness of the oppressed to submit to that force. 300,000 peasants had discovered they outnumbered their oppressors 100 to 1. They had discovered that knowledge was not, by itself, enough. But they had also discovered that it was a beginning, a foundation upon which future generations might build. The battle had been lost, but the idea, once born, could not be killed. And ideas, given time, can reshape the world more thoroughly than any army.